Welcome back. This is the second video covering the set of notes that are titled the Pre and Early Middle Ages Part 2. Last video, the first video in this short section was on Gregory the Great, and now we're going to be moving to another early Middle Age theologian and philosopher by the name of Boethius. So let's go ahead and get into Boethius. Boethius was born sometime between 470 AD and 480, we're not really sure, in medieval Italy. As we've seen with a number of these guys, he was born into a politically influential family. In his case, however, his father died when Boethius was still an adolescent, and so Boethius was taken care of by Quintus Aurelius Memmius Symmachus, another Roman statesman. Boethius married Symmachus' daughter, Rusticiana, and basically Symmachus was a virtual father and friend to Boethius for the rest of his life, and helped in his career. This upbringing destined Boethius for political influence, which he achieved under King Theodoric the Great, who was a ruler of the Ostrogoths in Italy. And you mentioned earlier that when, in an earlier lecture, that when the barbarians, so-called, defeated the Romans, and typically a lot of people think that was the fall of the Roman Empire, but really what happened is that the barbarians, so-called, simply just replaced the Romans, took over their culture, took over their law, took over their positions of political authority, and even though they weren't ethnically Romans, or certainly not from Italy, they began ruling the Roman Empire with all of the same structures and cultural elements that had been there already. So, but they didn't do as good a job in administration, and so that's really why the Roman Empire declined. But in any case, they did have this political authority, and Boethius became an administrator under this King Theodoric, and he actually rose to the position of consul in 510, rising to one of the highest positions within the king's palace by 520. So this Boethius certainly looked like he had a rising career in the political government at the time. Following this family tradition, he entered upon a distinguished political career, again came to the attention of Theodoric, and after serving in a number of capacities, again we noted he was appointed consul, and then achieved a fairly important position in 522. However, tragically, Boethius was accused of treason, and we're not really sure about the circumstances about all of this. Certain charges were leveled against Boethius, not really sure what, perhaps because he was ethnically and by his family background, he was Roman, as opposed to being one of these so-called barbarians, and maybe they suspected him of seeking to undermine the government. It's not really clear. It's unclear to this day whether he was actually guilty of treason, or what seems more likely just a victim of the instability of imperial politics of the day. In any case, the charges probably had to do with the ongoing conflict between the Orthodox Byzantine Emperor Justin I and King Theodoric. Theodoric was Arian, and he had, again, in the West, they had almost eradicated Arianism, but when the again, barbarians who were Arian Christians were in power, that sort of flipped the theological positions of power. Boethius had publicly supported his fellow senator, Albinus, when the latter was accused of treason, and that may have soured his relationship with the king. And his father-in-law, as we've seen, Symmachus, made a futile attempt to protect Boethius, and for that he himself was accused of treason. And ultimately and tragically, both men were imprisoned and executed in 524. Boethius is best known today for his work Consolation of Philosophy, which he wrote while he was in prison after he'd been arrested and before he was executed, obviously. The Consolation imagines philosophy as a woman who comes to comfort Boethius as he waits execution. So that's the consolation of philosophy. He uses a Platonic framework, or we would say a Neoplatonic framework. You guys have been exposed to that term in previous lectures, in which ultimate good is defended against injustice. According to the Consolation, good will prevail despite man's evil choices, and God's providence is reinforced by using the language and logic of Greek philosophy. The question here is this work really a Christian work by a Christian, or is it just a philosophical work by somebody operating with a philosophical perspective or worldview? Well, it's it was probably, because it was written in prison, it's likely that Boethius did intend that we should see that his perspective is a Christian perspective, but again, he's more interested in dealing with the question of the problem of his troubles through the eyes of a philosopher. So he wrote this dialogue, Consolation of Philosophy, in 5 books, in which he extolled the value of philosophy in helping someone to face adversity, and has become one of the most popular philosophical books of the medieval period, and is still read and studied today. The point of this consolation is that the world is just a fleeting shadow compared to the timeless eternal world. So even if you fall upon hard times, as hard as the times that Boethius had, you should still anticipate that ultimately the world's going to pass away. So it either doesn't make that much difference, when if you're a Christian, you can sort of expect that the perspective of eternity is going to be much better. Or that last point is more implied in the Consolation of Philosophy than actually explicitly pointed out. The philosopher who knows this will not be perturbed by the vicissitudes of this world. Although the work's not, again, explicitly Christian, it was taken as extolling Christian virtues of resignation and fortitude. We might simply say faith and perseverance. The 5th book contains an important discussion concerning divine foreknowledge and human freedom, and this parallels the views of Augustine that we've already seen on the subject of predestination. But Boethius gives that perspective a little bit more of a philosophical bent, and again was influential for many years to come. Boethius also had an influence on education, a very big one in one sense, because he invented the term and very program of the quadrivium, the university curriculum of the Middle Ages. So this particular way of basically the introduction of something that we might call even liberal arts was something that Boethius advocated. He composed textbooks on the quadrivium, and not all of which have survived, but he himself coined that phrase, the quadrivium, the fourfold path, referring to arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. In philosophy, beyond just the consolation of philosophy, and beyond this general pedagogical contribution, Boethius also translated a number of works from Greek philosophers, the logic works of Aristotle. He translated those into Latin, which, because the knowledge of the Greek language had declined through the Middle Ages. We saw that Augustine didn't know Greek very well. Gregory did, but basically he didn't do any translating work. So given the lack of knowledge of Greek language in the medieval Western world, Boethius' work in this area was highly influential. It wasn't until the 12th century that people, by that time, Aquinas and others, had access to the works of Aristotle that were more or less complete. Actually, they came through Arabic translations, so they didn't even come directly from Greek translations, but at least by the 12th century, the works of Aristotle and other Greek philosophers were more widely known. Well, if Boethius had lived and had continued his translation projects, it's only a matter of conjecture as to how much more quickly Greek philosophy of Aristotle and others might have influenced Christian and Western theology. This is just saying the same thing from another author. Boethius' contribution to medieval thought were many. The thinkers of the 11th and 12th centuries gained from him most of the knowledge of Aristotle they possessed in his translations of Aristotelian logical works and commentaries on them, and his independent treatise formed the foundations of their logical work. So until those those other translations of Aristotle appeared, everybody there was pretty much dependent upon what Boethius had translated and what he had included of the Greek philosophers in his own language. In theology, Boethius' contributions lie in his Opuscula Sacra, or Sacred Little Works, a group of 5 little tracts which covers issues relating to the doctrines of the Trinity, and he pretty much followed Trinitarian orthodoxy and what both another author we haven't mentioned, Hilary of Poitiers, and also Augustine had already sort of had written about in terms of the Trinity. Given the fact that Boethius' work on the Trinity was to be the standard textbook in the Middle Ages, and that writing a commentary on it was to be a basic part of theological education, the importance of his work in this area cannot be overestimated. So he became actually an authority on the Trinity for the Middle Ages. What Boethius does in his tractates is to offer defense of the doctrine of Trinity, where again he assumes the truth of the Nicene position, but then deploys logic in order to demonstrate how Trinitarian theology requires a careful analysis of language, how language is used. And we've seen this in earlier lectures on Augustine, how it was the language and how we speak about God that is really the best we can do, because we're not going to understand God from the inside. But a careful analysis of how language is used and how Aristotelian logical categories can help us in articulating what we know to be the truth of the Nicene position about the Trinity. Only in this way, Boethius argues, can we understand how the language of unity and multiplicity be applied to the Godhead. And again, we've seen how that was a difficult lecture, perhaps earlier on Augustine on the Trinity, but they continued to try and refine those ideas as the Middle Ages began and continued. Summary. Boethius was the last of the Roman philosophers and the first of scholastic theologians, as some have said. Boethius was, next to Augustine, one of the most decisive and formative influences on pre-13th century Christian thought. Again, mostly because it wasn't until later on that they had those translations of Aristotle and more of what Aristotle and the other philosophers had actually written. Even after the reintroduction of the complete Aristotelian corpus diminished his importance, the scholastics continued to study his works and comment upon them. All right, well, again, we will stop this particular video and pick up the last video in this series covering this particular set of PowerPoint notes.